On today's lesson of the Cold War era, we're going to be focusing on three major things that were developing during the time in terms of political alliances and people working together. And so, South Carolina Curriculum Standard Indicator 5-5.4 is the explain the international political alliances that impacted the United States in the latter part of the 20th century, including the United Nations, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or also known as NATO, and the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, also known as OPEC. So if you would take a minute and set this up on the next clean page in your interactive notebook, and then I'm going to advance in the lesson. So there's a couple things that we want to talk about today, and the first of those is the United Nations. So as a result of World War II, many nations wanted to avoid war in the future. Representatives from 50 nations met to establish a new organization called the United Nations. The purpose of the United Nations was to find peaceful solutions to international issues. It provided a forum for debating world issues and a means for policing local efforts while encouraging standards of humanitarian behavior. The United States includes a General Assembly and the Security Council. Permanent members of the Security Council were the allies of World War II. So the United States will always be on the Security Council of the UN. So the United Nations, and the thing I want you to keep in mind is the purpose. And the purpose of the United Nations was to find that peaceful solution because they wanted to avoid war. And there have been wars since the formation of the United Nations, but UN ends up involved in talks to try to avoid such conflicts. The other thing I wanted to point out to you is that it includes these two bodies. If you think about a General Assembly, think back a little bit about South Carolina history that you learned in third grade, in that there is a General Assembly in our government. Think about what that meant. And then there's a council, and the council is meant to be a smaller organization of that. So the next organization I want to talk about is NATO. And NATO is a military alliance that was originally established in response to growing threat of the Soviet Union following World War II. So if you think about that containment policy of the last lesson and being able to restrict communism and not allowing it to spread, that threat of the Soviet Union is what brings NATO into existence. The original members included Western European nations, the United States, and Canada. The membership has grown to 26 nations, including Eastern European nations, formerly part of the Soviet bloc. Each member of NATO agreed to defend each other should the Soviet Union attack. In most cases, the United States seeks the support of NATO and or the United Nations before becoming directly involved in international conflicts. When we end up in a conflict, such as the war in Iraq that breaks out in the early 2000s, the United States actually goes in lines of communication with them to try to get their backing, try to bring in support so that other countries are going to support you if you need them during a war. So it originally gets focused on the Soviet Union and that threat following World War II of communism and the Cold War era and nuclear weapons, but today is still in existence and looks as a way to be able to help support. And if you think about it, kind of building alliances in another way. Some things to remember. The military alliance originally established in response to the growing threat of the Soviet Union following World War II. And then thinking about what happens today is that the United States seeks the support of NATO and the United Nations before becoming directly involved in international conflicts. So kind of thinking about why it's important today to the United States. The last organization we're going to talk about is OPEC. And OPEC is actually an organization that you can hear about on the news from time to time. because OPEC is connected to oil. And so, as a nation, the United States relies on a large amount of oil. And this is a big topic in our country right now, especially when people look at gas prices and what they're paying at the pump to fill up their vehicles. As a country, we drive larger vehicles than some other countries. Some of your European countries that drive smaller cars. The United States, there are more people that drive large SUVs and trucks. Well, those take more gas. So this is a very important issue in our country right now. The United States must import much of this oil from other countries. OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, was organized by the nations of the world who produce petroleum products. This organization plays a major role in determining the rate of petroleum production as well as the price of their products. So they determine how much they're producing and at what they're going to sell it. The United States must work together with OPEC to ensure that Americans receive the petroleum products necessary to sustain our level of usage. There was actually an energy crisis that happened in the 1970s that showed that we needed to cooperate because actually there was a gas shortage in America and gas stations ran out. And then there was no supply to be able to restock. So the country has learned that we do have to work in alliance with OPEC and those countries because we depend upon that oil supply. There is conversation right now in America very much about us becoming oil independent so that we're able to produce all of our own oil. And a lot of that would come through offshore drilling. So things I want you to know about this. Keep in mind what OPEC stands for and kind of where they came from and who's a part. Then I want you to think about why they are important and what they determine for us here in our country. And they're controlling the supply and the price of petroleum. So the activity for this lesson is that I want you to write a summary that explains the impact of the United Nations, NATO, and OPEC on the United States. Think about each one of those and how is it important to life here in our country.